Supporters of bringing Ukraine into NATO sometimes argue that Moscow should not have been concerned about enlargement because, quote, NATO is a defensive alliance and poses no threat to Russia. Mike McFaul, who was the American ambassador to Moscow at the time, has told me that he told Putin that on numerous occasions, that Putin had nothing to fear from NATO expansion. It was led by a benign hegemon known as the United States, and NATO is not a threat. But that is not how Russian leaders think about Ukraine and NATO, and it is what they think that matters. I just would quickly point out to you, I have a number of friends who deny that NATO expansion into Ukraine is an existential threat. My response to them is it doesn't matter what you think. All that matters is what the Russians think. And it's manifestly clear that the Russians see NATO expansion into Ukraine as an existential threat. And as Angela Merkel said, they will see it as a declaration of war. In some, there's no question that Putin saw Ukraine joining NATO as a mortal threat that could not be allowed and was willing to go to war to prevent it from happening, which he did, of course, in February of 2022. Now, let me talk a bit about the course of the war, what's happening in the war. After the Istanbul negotiations failed, this is in April 2022. Remember, the war starts February 2022, and then the negotiations failed by mid-April 2022. The Ukraine conflict turned into a war of attrition, bearing actually marked similarities to World War I on the Western Front. This war, which has been a brutal slugfest, has now been going on for 3.5 years. And during that time, as you all know, Russia has formally annexed 4 Ukrainian oblasts, in addition to Crimea, which it annexed in 2014. In effect, Russia has so far annexed about 22% of Ukraine's pre-2014 territory, and all of that, of course, is in the eastern 1/5 of the country. The West has provided enormous support to Ukraine since the war broke out, doing everything but directly engaging in the fighting. It's no accident that Russian leaders think that their country is at war with the West. Nevertheless, as you well know, President Trump is determined to sharply limit America's role in the war and shift the burden of supporting Ukraine onto Europe's shoulders. Now, Russia is clearly winning this war, and it's likely to prevail. And I believe the reason is very simple. In a war of attrition, each side tries to bleed the other side white, which means that the side that has more soldiers and more firepower is likely to emerge victorious. Russia has a significant advantage on both dimensions. For example, General Syrski says that Russia now has 3 times more forces engaged in the fight than Ukraine does. And he says that at some points along the front lines, the Ukrainians are outnumbered 6-1. So it's an overall ratio of 3-1, says Syrski, and at some points it's 6-1. And in fact, according to numerous reports from the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainians do not have enough soldiers to defend the front lines. They can't thickly populate the front lines with their combat forces. They have to leave open spaces that the Russians can exploit or penetrate. In terms of firepower, throughout most of the war, Russia's advantage in artillery, which is a critically important weapon in attrition warfare, Russia has had an advantage reported to be either 3-1, 7-1, or 10-1. Russia also has a huge inventory of highly accurate glide bombs, which they have used with deadly effectiveness against Ukrainian defenses. Kyiv has hardly any glide bombs. While there's no question that Ukraine has a highly effective drone fleet, which was initially more effective than Russia's drone fleet, Russia has turned the tables over the past year, and Russia now has an upper hand with drones as well as artillery, as well as glide bombs. It's important to emphasize that Kyiv has no viable solution to its manpower problem, as it has a much smaller population than Russia, and it is plagued by draft dodging and desertion. Reports are that in October, 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers deserted from their frontline positions. That is a remarkable number. Moreover, Russia has a robust industrial base which produces vast quantities of weaponry, while Ukraine's industrial base is paltry. To compensate, Ukraine depends heavily on the West for weaponry, but Western countries lack the manufacturing capability necessary to keep up with Russian output. To make matters worse, Trump is slowing down the flow of American weaponry to Ukraine. The bottom line is that Ukraine is badly outmanned, badly outgunned, which is fatal in a war of attrition. On top of that dire situation on the battlefield, Russia has a huge inventory of missiles, both ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, and drones that it uses to strike deep into Ukraine and destroy critical infrastructure and weapons depots. For sure, Kyiv has the capability to hit targets deep inside Russia with its drones, but it has nowhere near the striking power Moscow possesses. Moreover, striking targets deep inside Russia is going to have little effect on what happens on the battlefield where this war is being settled. What about the prospects for a peaceful settlement? There's been much discussion over the course of 2025 about finding a diplomatic settlement to the end of the war. This conversation is due in good part to President Trump's promise that he would settle the Ukraine war even before he moved into the White House. And if he didn't solve it before he moved into the White House, he would settle it shortly after he moved in. He obviously failed. Indeed, he has not even come close to succeeding. The sad truth is that there is no hope of negotiating a meaningful peace agreement. This war will be settled on the battlefield, where the Russians are likely to win an ugly victory. I'm choosing my words carefully here. They're going to win an ugly victory that results in a frozen conflict with Russia on one side and Ukraine, Europe, and the United States on the other side. Let me explain. Settling the war diplomatically is not possible because the opposing sides have irreconcilable differences. Moscow insists that Ukraine must be a neutral country, which means it not only cannot be in NATO, it can't have meaningful security guarantees from the West. Russians insist on that. The Russians also demand that Ukraine and the West recognize their annexation of Crimea plus the 4 oblasts that they've annexed in eastern Ukraine. And their third demand is that Kyiv limit the size of its military to the point where it presents no meaningful military threat to Russia. Unsurprisingly, Europe, and especially Ukraine, categorically reject these demands. Ukraine refuses to concede any territory to Russia, which you can understand, while Europe and Ukraine continue to push to bring Ukraine into NATO, or at least allow the West to give Ukraine meaningful security guarantees. Disarming Ukraine to the point where it satisfies Moscow is also a non-starter. There's no way these opposing positions, the Russian position and the Ukraine plus West position, can be reconciled to produce a peace agreement. Thus, the war will be settled on the battlefield. Although I believe the Russians will win and are close to winning now, it will not win. The Russians will not win a decisive victory where they end up conquering all of Ukraine. I want to be very clear on that. Instead, it's likely to be, as I said, an ugly victory where Russia ends up occupying somewhere between 20 to 40% of pre-2014 Ukraine, while Ukraine ends up as a dysfunctional rump state covering the territory that Russia does not conquer. Moscow is unlikely to try to conquer all of Ukraine because the western 60% of that country is filled with ethnic Ukrainians who would mightily resist a Russian occupation and turn it into a nightmare for the occupying forces. All of this is to say that the likely outcome of the Ukraine war is a frozen conflict between a greater Russia and a rump Ukraine backed by Europe. Let me now explore the likely consequences of the Ukraine war, focusing first on the consequences for Ukraine itself, and then on the consequences for relations between Europe and Russia, and then finally, I'll turn to the likely consequences inside of Europe as well as for transatlantic relations. Starting with Ukraine. Ukraine has effectively been wrecked. It has already lost a substantial portion of its territory and is likely to lose more land before the fighting stops. Its economy is in tatters with no prospect of recovery in the foreseeable future. And according to my calculations, it has suffered roughly 1 million casualties. A staggering number for any country, but certainly for one that is said to be in, quote, a demographic death spiral. Russia has paid a significant price as well, but it has suffered nowhere near as much as Ukraine. Europe will almost certainly remain allied with rump Ukraine for the foreseeable future, given sunk costs and the profound Russophobia that pervades the West. But that continuing relationship between Europe and Ukraine will not work to Kyiv's advantage for two reasons. First, it will incentivize Moscow to interfere in Ukraine's domestic affairs to cause it economic and political trouble, so that it is not a threat to Europe and is in no position to join either NATO or the EU. Second, Europe's commitment to supporting Kyiv no matter what motivates Russia to conquer as much Ukrainian territory as possible while the war is raging, so as to maximize the weakness of the Ukrainian rump state that remains once the conflict is frozen. In other words, if you're playing Putin's hand and you believe the Europeans are going to be deeply committed to Ukraine for the foreseeable future, you have a deep-seated interest in grabbing Odessa, grabbing Kharkiv, and grabbing all the oblasts in between. You want to take 40% of Ukrainian territory. You want to do everything you can to wreck Ukraine, and then you want to keep Ukraine weak for the foreseeable future, because you understand the Europeans will be supporting the Ukrainians and they will be interested in causing you, Russia, trouble. So the basic point I'm making here is that maintaining close relations with Ukraine is not going to work to Ukraine's advantage. What about relations between Europe and Russia moving forward? They are likely to be poisonous as far as the eye can see. Europeans, and surely the Ukrainians, will work to undermine Moscow's efforts to integrate Ukrainian territories that Russia has annexed, as well as look for opportunities to cause the Russians economic and political trouble. Russia, for its part, will look for opportunities to cause economic and political trouble inside Europe. And between Europe and the U.S., Russian leaders both will have powerful incentives to fracture, Russian leaders will have a powerful incentive to fracture the West as much as possible, since the West also will have its gun sights on Russia. And one does not want to forget that Russia will be working to keep Ukraine dysfunctional while Europe will be working to make it functional. Relations between Europe and Russia will not only be poisonous, they will also be dangerous. The possibility of war will be ever present. In addition to the risk that war between Ukraine and Russia could restart, there are 6 other flashpoints where a war pitting Russia against one or more European countries could break out. First, consider the Arctic, where the melting ice has opened the door to competition over passageways and resources. Remember that 7 of the 8 countries that are physically located in the Arctic are NATO members. Russia is the 8th country, which means that it is outnumbered 7-1 by NATO countries in that strategically important area. The second flashpoint is the Baltic Sea, which is sometimes referred to as a NATO lake because it is largely surrounded by countries from the alliance. That waterway, however, is of vital strategic interest to Russia, as is Kaliningrad, the Russian enclave in Eastern Europe, that is also surrounded by NATO countries. The fourth flashpoint is Belarus, which, because of its size and location, is as strategically important to Russia as Ukraine. The Europeans and the Americans, however, will surely try to install a pro-American or pro-Western government in Minsk after President Lukashenko leaves office, and eventually hope to turn Belarus into a pro-Western bulwark on Russia's borders. The West is already deeply involved in the politics of Moldova, which not only borders Ukraine, but contains a breakaway region known as Transnistria, which is occupied by Russian troops. The final flashpoint is the Black Sea, which is of great strategic importance to both Russia and Ukraine, as well as a handful of European countries, which include Bulgaria, Greece, Romania, and Turkey. As with the Baltic Sea, there is much potential for trouble in the Black Sea. All of this is to say that even after Ukraine becomes a frozen conflict, Europe and Russia will continue to have hostile relations in a geopolitical setting filled with trouble spots. In other words, the threat of a major European war will not go away when the fighting in Ukraine stops. Let me now turn to the consequences of the war for inside of Europe, and then turn to its likely effects on the transatlantic relationship. For starters, it cannot be emphasized enough that a Russian victory in Ukraine, even if it is an ugly victory, as I anticipate, would be a stunning defeat for Europe. Or to put it in slightly different words, it would be a stunning defeat for NATO, which has been deeply involved in the Ukraine conflict since it started. Indeed, the alliance has been committed to defeating Russia since February 2022. NATO's defeat will lead to recrimination between member states and inside many of them as well. Who is to blame for this catastrophe will matter greatly to the governing elites in Europe, and surely there will be a powerful tendency to blame others and not accept responsibility themselves. The debate over who lost Ukraine will take place in a Europe that is already racked by fractious politics, both between countries and inside them. In addition to these political fights, some will question the future of NATO, given that it failed to check Russia, the country that most European leaders describe as a mortal threat. It seems almost certain that NATO will be much weaker after the Ukraine war is shut down than before that war started. Any weakening of NATO will have negative repercussions for the EU, because, as I said earlier, a stable security environment in Europe is essential for the EU to flourish, and NATO is the key to stability in Europe. Threats to the EU aside, the great reduction in the flow of gas and oil to Europe since the war started has seriously hurt the major economies of Europe and slowed down growth in the overall Eurozone. There's good reason to think that economic growth across Europe is a long way from recovering after that war in Ukraine turns into a frozen conflict. A defeat in Ukraine is also likely to lead to a transatlantic blame game, especially since the Trump administration has refused to support Kyiv as vigorously as the Biden administration, and instead pushed the Europeans to assume more of the burden of keeping Ukraine in the fight. Thus, when the war finally ends with a Russian victory, Trump can accuse the Europeans of not stepping up to the plate, while the European leaders can accuse Trump of bailing out on Ukraine in its greatest moment of need. Of course, Trump's relations with Europe have long been contentious, so these recriminations will only make a bad situation worse. Then there's the all-important question of whether the United States will significantly reduce its military footprint in Europe, or maybe even pull all of its combat troops out of Europe. As I emphasized at the start of my talk, independent of the Ukraine war, the historic shift from unipolarity to multipolarity has created a powerful incentive for the United States to pivot to East Asia, which effectively means pivoting away from Europe. That move alone, that move alone has the potential to put an end to NATO, which is another way of saying an end to the pacifier in Europe. What has happened in Ukraine since 2022 makes that outcome more likely to repeat. Trump has a deep-seated hostility to Europe, especially its leaders, and he will blame them for losing Ukraine. He has no great affection for NATO and has described the EU as an enemy created, quote, to screw the United States. That's Trump talking about the United States. It's an enemy designed to, quote unquote, screw the United States. And he has 3.5 more years left in office, I will note. Furthermore, the fact that Ukraine lost the war, despite enormous support from NATO, is likely to lead him, President Trump, to trash the alliance as ineffective and useless. That line of argument will allow him to push Europe to provide for its own security and not free ride on the United States. In short, it seems likely that the results of the Ukraine war, coupled with the spectacular rise of China, will eat away at the fabric of the transatlantic relationship in the years ahead, much to the detriment of Europe. I'd like to close now with a few general observations. For starters, the Ukraine war has been a disaster. Indeed, it is a disaster that is almost certain to keep giving in the years ahead. It has had catastrophic consequences for Ukraine. It has poisoned relations between Europe and Russia for the foreseeable future, and it has made Europe a more dangerous place. It has also caused serious economic and political harm inside Europe and badly damaged transatlantic relations. This calamity raises the inevitable question, Who's responsible for this war? This question will not go away anytime soon, and if anything, is likely to become more prominent over time as the extent of the damage becomes more apparent to more people. The answer, of course, is that the United States and its European allies are principally responsible. The April 2008 decision to bring Ukraine into NATO, which the West has relentlessly pursued since then, doubling down on this commitment at every opportunity, is the main driving force behind the Ukraine war. Most European leaders, and I'm sure most people in the various European publics, will blame Putin for causing the war, and thus for its terrible consequences. But they are wrong. The war could have been avoided if the West had not decided to bring Ukraine into NATO, or even if it had backed off from that commitment once the Russians made their opposition clear. Had that happened, Ukraine would almost certainly be intact today within its pre-2014 borders, and Europe would be more stable and more prosperous. You just want to think about what I'm saying here. Had we not made the decision to bring Ukraine into NATO in April of 2008, or if, once having made that decision, we saw how clear-cut Russian opposition was, had we backed off, Ukraine would be intact today inside its pre-2014 borders. Crimea would still be part of Ukraine. And furthermore, Europe would be a more prosperous and more stable place than it is. But that ship has sailed, and Europe must now deal with the disastrous results of a series of